Good morning. So today we're going to start a bit of a series looking at Psalm 23, one of the most well-known, most beloved bit of Bible. In fact, it's known not just by us in the church, but even people outside of the church know this psalm really well. And I was reminded about that this week. I was just mindlessly scrolling through social media, and a joke came up. It was what's the guy, Larson? That guy? Yeah, he had a joke, and it was a chicken crossing the road, and it was a KFC on the other side. And the chicken was saying, "Though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil." And I thought about that and thought that the joke writer here is assuming that everybody knows the psalm. A lot of assumed knowledge there. Anyway, there's a bit of a problem sometimes when we're really familiar with a bit of the Bible, because familiarity sometimes crowds out curiosity. And we read it, and we just assume that I understand it. I get it. I've heard it before. Tick. I know it. But over the next 6-7 weeks, we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking deep into this psalm. And we're going to try to plumb some of its depths. And I can guarantee you that I'm going to learn things that I didn't know. And I'm hopeful that we all will. Even this week, as I've been thinking about, I'm going to be looking at verse 1. I've discovered things that I hadn't really seen before. I hadn't noticed before. And hopefully over the next 6-7 weeks, we're all going to get a really fresh look at this beloved old psalm. Now, it's a psalm of David. Helen shared that with us before. And there's actually a bit of contention over when David wrote it. Some people think he wrote it when he was a young man. He's a shepherd. He was out in the fields with the sheep, and the concept of sheep and shepherds was fresh in his mind, and he wrote it as a young man. Other people say, impossible. This psalm is way too wise. There's just too much wisdom and understanding there to be written by a young man. This was written by David when he was an old man. And at the end of his life, he looked back and he was able to say, through my whole life, the Lord has been my shepherd. There's another theory, and it's one that I subscribe to, not fanatically and not dogmatically, but if I was to be pushed on what I think, this is a theory that I would subscribe to. And that is that David wrote this psalm in the darkest time of his life, when his son Absalom rose up against him, tried to kill him, and drove him out of the kingdom. And David was forced to flee his home into the wilderness, assuming he had most likely lost everything. His family had completely imploded. His own son was trying to kill him. And I think that's when David wrote this psalm. And the reason I think that is, if we think about human history, Psalm 23 has always been where we go when life is difficult, when things haven't worked out the way we wanted, when we feel troubled, when we feel grief. This is when we go to Psalm 23, and I think it resonates because that's when David wrote this psalm. We're going to read it again. We read it earlier. I'm going to read it again. But before we do that, I want you to listen to some words written by a very old preacher called Henry Ward Beecher. He wrote this in 1860. And Henry Beecher was a massive fan of Psalm 23. In fact, he said it's the greatest of all psalms. Listen to what he said about this psalm. He says, "It has charmed more griefs to rest than all the philosophy of the world. It has comforted the noble host of the poor. It has sung courage to the army of the disappointed. It has poured balm and consolation into the heart of the sick, of captives in dungeons, of widows in their grief, of orphans in their loneliness. Dying soldiers have died easier as it was read to them. This psalm has visited the prisoner and broken his chains. It has made the Christian slave freer than his master. And I love this next bit. Psalm 23 will go on singing to our children and to their children through all the generations of time. It will not fold its wings till the last pilgrim is safe and time has ended. And then, and only then, it shall fly back to the bosom of God from whence it was issued. So we're going to read this psalm again. Now, like many of you, I learnt this psalm to memory when I was in primary school. And I went to a real old school Sunday school, and we used the King James Bible. And so whenever I recall Psalm 23, it comes to me in the King James Version. So that's what we're going to read. In fact, I found now, when I try to recite it, all the translations have muddled me up, and I trip over words now when I try to recite it. So we're going to read it again. I just want to point out something to you before we read it. And that is, when we translate from Hebrew to English, we lose some of the beautiful poetic structure that was there in the original. And in the original Hebrew, it's structured in a way that the central line there, for thou art with me, sits in the middle of the psalm, and everything sort of hinges and pivots off that. In fact, in Hebrew, there's exactly 26 words before and 26 words after. Let me read this psalm to you again. It's one we know well. We've heard it many times before. But let's listen and let's hear it again as a gift. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, when you listen to that psalm, I wonder what images you conjure up with words like green pastures, still waters, things like that. And I know for me, I grew up, when I was a kid, I grew up in a time where everyone had Bible texts in their home. Certainly the Christians I knew. You could tell, you went into a home, you could tell straight away if they were a Christian or not because there were Bible texts everywhere. And Psalm 23 was a common text to see on people's walls. And it was always there with a beautiful pastoral scene. Normally looked like something from England. Lush green grass, big shady trees, a little trickling brook or a little pond. Very idyllic, very beautiful, but very, very English. And if we go to the next slide, this is a photo I took a couple of years ago when I was on holiday. That's in the Cotswolds in England. We went for a walk on a Sunday afternoon through a sheep paddock. And these are the sorts of images that I used to conjure up when I used to read Psalm 23. Beautiful grass, lots of shade, happy little sheep running around, lots of an abundance of water. In fact, that was such a magical time, that walk, Because actually, one of the things that happens, I wrestled Jake. And I absolutely destroyed him. Got on top of him, he was begging for mercy. I completely overpowered him. But that's kind of the image that we conjure up when we think of Psalm 23. And actually that's a bit of a problem because Psalm 23 is not a psalm of prosperity. It's actually not about abundance. And in fact, pastures like that did not exist in David's time. So if we go on to the next slide, this is actually the green pastures of the Judean hills. This is sheep country in Judea. There were small amounts of fertile flat ground, but they were reserved exclusively for crops and for vineyards. And shepherds were forced to take their sheep up into these hills. I don't know about you, but when I look at that, first thing I think about is, where's the grass? It's a desert, where's the water? In the middle of a hot day, where's the shade? If a storm comes, where could you take shelter? How are you meant to navigate sheep up and down those steep slopes? This is the green pastures of Psalm 23. In fact, I'm not sure if you know this, but the Judean wilderness is actually a really significant character in the Bible. It's a character that is actually a picture of when life is difficult, when life's tough, dark times. But it's also a picture sometimes of just life in general. And just like life, we look at that and we just see what lacks. And sometimes we think about our own life, we think about what we are lacking, what we wish we had, what there's a lack of. Maybe it's health, financial security, maybe it's relationships. We look out there and we see what we lack. But for sheep with a good shepherd, not only will they survive in those hills, but they'll actually thrive. And so just again, our problem with our thinking about Western pastures, if we go on to the next slide, this is one of our pastures we have down at Stanthorpe. And we've got a small herd of cattle down there. It's only not very big, 100 acres. And those cattle rely on us completely to provide for them. Now, we've got 5 paddocks. And every 3-4 weeks, we put them into a new paddock. And normally I just go to the gate and I call them. And they come running because they know when I call, they're going to get a new paddock. And normally when they've been in a paddock 3 or 4 weeks, they've eaten down all their favourite types of grass, and there's normally just rougher grass left. And they start to get a bit antsy, and if they see me, they start bellowing. And they'll run around following me, bellowing, basically having a tantrum, wanting to be let into a new pasture. And they recognise my voice. They also recognise my ute. When they see my white Hilux coming, they come running. And I had a friend once who also had a white Hilux. He turned up, and he thought he was being stampeded. But the thing with these cattle is once I open the gate, there's so much grass that I then become invisible. I'm done. They're done with me. I've opened the gate, they've got their new pasture, and now I'm forgotten until maybe a month down the track. And so they're pretty self-sufficient. So right now, they're down there by themselves. They're in a paddock with plenty of grass, plenty of water. They don't actually need me. In a few weeks, I'll go down and put them in a new paddock. Now, that's very different for sheep in the Judean hills. So if we go to the next slide, in the Judean hills, very little rain. Rains very, very rarely. In fact, most moisture comes from humid winds. And what happens is that humid air comes across and hits the side of the mountain, and then moisture condenses on the rocks, and little droplets of moisture will run down the rocks and create little spots of moisture. And in those spots of moisture, little blades of grass will shoot up. And they're metres apart. And so when the shepherds are leading their sheep, they are watching the winds. They're watching to see where moisture is accumulating. And when the shepherd leads the sheep through the Judean hills, he doesn't just bring them to an area and leave them for weeks. He's only leading them 10, 15 minutes at a time. And so the sheep, it's literally minute by minute, hour by hour, that they are following the shepherd. Psalm 23 is a wilderness psalm. And it's actually an invitation. David is inviting us to, in the wilderness, to just put our eyes to the Good Shepherd and to trust him, minute by minute, hour by hour, and day by day. Okay, let's go through to the next slide. Today we're just going to think about the first verse in this psalm. And so, pretty short and simple, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Some of the newer translations say things like, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. And that's a fine translation, but I actually think this is more literal. And I actually think this is a better translation at getting what David is trying to get across. David's point here is that when the Lord is our shepherd, and when we are following him, watching him, allowing him to lead us, we actually don't want. We're not thinking about tomorrow. We're not worrying about the future because we're trusting him to provide hour by hour and day by day. And this term of God as a shepherd is a wonderful, rich analogy right throughout the Bible. In fact, in the Old Testament, there's lots of different names that are used to describe God. A rock, a shield, a fortress, a warrior. They're all useful. They all tell us something. But a shepherd is one of the very few names that actually carries through the New Testament. A lot of those other names, they're helpful, but they're very one-dimensional. They're very abstract. The shepherd is such a rich picture. It tells us so much about who God is and what God wants from us. And this is one of the few names that Jesus actually uses. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep. My sheep know me, and I know them. Let's think about this expression here, I shall not want. Because it's a bit of an odd expression. Think of human beings, we are chronic wanters. We want non-stop. In fact, our economy, our capitalist economy, it relies on us constantly wanting new stuff. It relies on us being constantly dissatisfied with what we have and continually buying more and new stuff. And so this idea of a person who does not want seems impossible. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. We're constantly wanting. We're constantly craving, constantly desiring, constantly needing. So is it possible to not want? The Apostle Paul, I think, he shows us that it is possible. So I want us to have a quick look at is if we go to 2 Corinthians, we go to that next slide there. In this section here, the Apostle Paul talks about a struggle he had, which was he referred to as the thorn in his flesh, something he was grappling with. Now, he doesn't say what it is. He keeps it very vague. Some people think it was a physical struggle. Other people think it was he had a battle with depression. Some people think it was to do with relationship. But it's kept vague. Now, I think Paul keeps it vague for a reason, because he wants us to be able to insert our struggle. Paul wants us to, whatever our battle is, whatever it is that you are desperately craving, wanting, desiring, whatever it is that's giving you grief to be resolved, Paul allows us here to insert our own struggle into this. So let me read this passage, what Paul says here. In chapter 12, verse 7, he says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" So what I hear Paul saying in this passage is, I wanted desperately. I craved, I desired, I prayed, I asked, I desperately wanted. Then the Lord told me his grace is sufficient. And now I shall not want. I no longer want. In fact, not only does Paul just accept that, but he seems to go on there and sort of insinuates that his struggle is actually a gift. His desperate wanting, his desperate need not being met is actually a gift, because it's made him weak. It's forced him to rely on the Good Shepherd, to trust the Shepherd minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. I'm sure all of us here today are all got a thorn in our flesh. I'm sure we've all got something we are desperately wanting, an unmet need, something we're craving, desperately hoping for. It seems maybe futile, may seem impossible. But Paul's telling us here that's actually a gift. That's actually going to help us to look to the Good Shepherd and to follow him, to trust him day by day, minute by minute. Now, we're going to take communion in just a moment, but I want to finish, if we go on to the next slide, I want to finish up thinking about an old hymn, which I think beautifully, encapsulates Psalm 23. And it's an interesting hymn. It was actually based, it's called Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. I'm sure we all know it. And it's an interesting hymn because it was originally written as a meditation by a missionary called Lilias Trotter. And she wrote it in 1901. And she was back on furlough from Africa as a missionary. And she went for a walk in a dark forest. It was dark and gloomy. It was wet and grey. And as she was walking through this dark, gloomy forest, the sun had just come up and she noticed a single dandelion in this dark forest. And the dandelion, like all flowers, had turned to face the sun. And in the dark gloom, that dandelion was glowing. It was shining beautifully. And the sight stopped her in her tracks. And she wrote a meditation called The Lesson of the Dandelion, of a picture of what happens when we turn our eyes to Jesus and we reflect his glory and we trust him in the midst of darkness. Years later, that meditation, The Lesson of the Dandelion, was put into a hymn. And these are the words of the hymn. O soul, are you weary and troubled? No light in the darkness you see. There's light for a look at the Saviour and life more abundant and free. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. In Psalm 23 is an invitation. It's an invitation for us in the middle of the wilderness to fix our eyes on the Good Shepherd, take our eyes off what looks like a lack, looks like unmet needs. Let's trust Jesus hour by hour, day by day. Let's trust in his riches of his grace. And so one of the things that we do regularly to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, to keep our gratitude, is we take communion. We take these bits of bread and juice, and it reminds us of his sacrifice. And it reminds us of the wonderful riches that we have in his grace, the hope, the contentment, the joy, the purpose, the satisfaction, and all that meaning. So hopefully over the next 6-7 weeks, we're going to have our eyes fixed on Jesus, and we'll trust him hour by hour. So let's come and grab some communion, and let's give thanks.